Hello Rebels, welcome to The Base. Have you subscribed yet on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts? It's incredibly important. We have a state to fix here. We need your support. We need to get the word out. Leave us a review, leave us your comments. We'll read out the best of them because we really are building a movement here to change this state for the better, and we want your help in doing it. So today, big issue. Wildfires, we know it's affecting so many people around the state. There's so much said about it that is ill-informed, ignorant, politicized. And so today we want to get to the facts from someone who really knows what they're talking about. And so our guest today is Jon Keeley from the US Geological Survey. Jon, it's great to see you today. This topic of wildfires is just such a huge issue affecting so many people in the state. And it's being talked about all the time. And I think with actually very little expertise in that conversation. And that's why I'm so excited you could join us today to bring some of that expertise. And I'd like to start off by just sort of asking you to respond to what I think is the kind of the primary framing of the wildfire issue right now in California. And you hear this the whole time. And to me, there's something not quite right about it, and I'd love you to explain why. The issue is framed as, well, this is climate change. Now you see it in action. The West is on fire. California is aflame. The last few years have been the hottest we've seen, and the last few years have seen the biggest wildfires we've ever seen. And so this all to do with climate change, and therefore the answer is to hasten the pace of whatever we're doing to deal with climate change. And to me, that is a slight sort of counsel of despair because, anything we might do on climate change, it's sort of so far off in terms of its potential impact. Yet these fires are happening now. And so I want to understand why they're happening now. And most importantly, what can we do to handle the problem now, not 100 years from now?
Well, thank you, Steve and Kristen. Nice to be here. There's no question climate change is potentially a factor involved in the big fires we've been seeing in recent years. The fires are not necessarily bigger than anything we've seen in the state. Historically, going back to the mid-1800s, we had really big fires. Mm-hmm. But what's different today is we're seeing many more of them. And the climatologists attribute this to climate change. And I wouldn't say they're wrong that climate is involved. But to me, it distracts from a real problem to say it's all due to climate change, because there are a multitude of factors, and probably some of these factors are far more important than climate change. For example, the big fire we're seeing right now in California, the Dixie Fire. It looks like it's going to be the biggest fire in California history. If you look at the history of fires on that landscape, one of the things you realize is, at least the last map I looked at, about 2/3 of that landscape has never had a recorded fire. And that's a critically important issue because these forests that are burning in Plumas County and other areas where the Dixie is burning, these forests historically have had frequent fires. We have good records based on fire scars that are left in trees that are standing, show that fires historically occurred at maybe anywhere from 10 to 30 year intervals in the past. We have good evidence that those forests that are burning now have gone at least 100 years and probably longer than that without a fire. What that means is the fuels in these forests are substantially larger than historically was the case. And depending upon the forest, there are estimates that the fuel load in these forests from very successful fire suppression, so successful that it actually represents fire exclusion for the last century, has resulted in some cases as much as 5-fold increase in the amount of fuels. So we have this massive fuel load on the landscape that almost certainly is a major driver of these big fire events. And then we add on to that the drought that we had in 2012 to 2014 in that region. And it resulted in an enormous amount of mortality of trees. Across the Sierra Nevada, we lost at least 1 million trees during that drought. And those trees represent dead fuels that represent a legacy on the landscape. They don't go away. And so we're dealing with a landscape that has had an anomalously long period without fire, as well as a severe drought. And both of these have contributed to substantial fuel loads in those forests. So it would be wrong to say what we're seeing is climate change. That doesn't mean climate change hasn't played a role. For example, this was an extremely hot year. We don't know to what extent the extraordinary temperatures we've seen this summer are due to climate change. But there's no question they've been hotter than normal. And so those hotter than normal conditions, coupled with the fact that we have had a drought this year, and I don't know the exact numbers for the plumas, but where I live in the southern part of the Sierras, we only had about 8 inches of rain when we normally get 25 inches. So severe drought in our part of the world. We're seeing a lot of mortality this year. So we have an anomalously large accumulation of fuels, something we've never seen in the past. So when people say, look, we haven't seen these fires in the past, we haven't seen the fuel loads that we're seeing now in the past.
And why? What causes that? So you say fire suppression, which sounds good, I think, to most listeners. So why is there so much fire suppression?
Well, it's an interesting debate, and it depends on where you live. For example, if you live in a very populated region like Southern California, fire suppression makes a lot of sense. However, fire suppression has not had an impact on fuels in that part of the world, and it's simply because the number of people have started sufficient number of fires under conditions that are really hard to put the fires out. So they haven't had a lack of fire in the last 100 years. We don't see an accumulation of fuels in Southern California. But you look in the Sierra Nevada, and that's a very different ecosystem. So when fire occurs in Sierra Nevada forest, commonly it comes from lightning strikes that hit fuels in the understory. They historically burned in low-intensity fires in the understory. And it's clear that those sorts of fires have been easy to put out. And so as a result, firefighters have been really successful at extinguishing fires, particularly lightning fires that burn in the understory. And
who's been successful? So you're saying that in the past the fires were smaller, and who put how were they suppressed?
We don't necessarily know they were smaller.
Right.
What we do know is they weren't high intensity fires that burned the entire canopy of the forest like we're seeing today, what we call crown fires. They were understory fires. They could have been large, but they weren't as destructive as the fires today. And this is largely due to the fact that these are forested landscapes. When the state and federal government took over these landscapes in the Sierra Nevada and Northern California, they put a great deal of emphasis on timber production. And as a result, they were very concerned about things that might impact timber value, and in particularly low intensity surface fires would scar trees and reduce timber value. It would reduce the density of trees, which reduced the amount of timber available. So they were suppressed uniformly throughout most of the 1900s, and it wasn't without debate. In the years between 1910 and 1920, there was a very vigorous debate in the literature about whether we should let fires burn in the understory like they did historically, or we should put them out. Ultimately, by about 1920, the fire suppression people, who largely were concerned about timber interests, but also interested in how best to preserve forest, and they were of the belief that they could eliminate fires from the forest. And it took us about 50, 60 years to finally come to the realization that we can't eliminate fires from these forests. And so the fire suppression has been successful for a long time, and it's resulted in almost total fire exclusion The Dixie Fire I mentioned, 2/3 of that landscape had never had a recorded fire, going all the way back to the 1800s. The same is true for most of the big fires in 2020. If you look
How
at
about how about the Calder fire? Because that fire is exploding right now.
I'm not familiar with it. I can't keep up.
Okay, yeah, exactly. There's so many. But the Calder fires at 65,000 acres, I mean, it seems to have an incredible amount of fuel to keep going as well. Now we're having to divert resources from Dixie to Calder. So I've got to imagine it's a similar situation where we've got these extraordinary supply of fuels,
Yeah.
which are fueling these
Well, let's,
fires at a rapidity. Yeah.
Well,
Well,
that's
I
the
would
thing.
expect that's the case, but I haven't looked at the Calder Fire. It's a matter of scale. The Calder Fire is small compared to what we're concerned about with the Dixie Fire, and so
True.
it
Well,
hasn't changed.
a couple of things, John. I just want to kind of make sure we've got this clear, and everyone who's listening can get this straight. Which is, you mentioned, I think, that there's a difference, or implied in what you were just saying, is there's a difference between the north and the south, and I want to of the state, and in terms of how we should think about wildfires. I want to get to that in a second. Let's just talk about the Sierra, the northern part of the state where we're seeing these fires right now. Just to be really clear about it, would it be correct to say, look, we've always had fires, wildfires? It's part of nature in this part of the world. Going back, way before the sort of white settlers that came across and so on. It's always been part of nature, but the last kind of 100 years of human activity have contributed to the fuel load, not because of the climate change, but because of the accumulation of the fuel, and that's one of the main reasons we're seeing the scale of the fires we're seeing now. Is that an accurate way of?
Yeah, I think you described it very clearly.
So,
and these historical fires go back a very long period of time, millions of years. We have good records that.
So let's just talk about then what do we do about it? Because this is what drives me so insane about. I'm sorry, I'm going to get a bit political here. You don't have to. You're the sort of expert here, but. When you hear the sort of political talk about this, it's like, oh, climate change. The answer is, therefore, we must ban, gas cars by 2030. Like, what the F difference is that going to make to any of these wildfires, right? Ever, let alone right now or next year, or the people who are worrying about it right now, either affected directly, losing their whole lives, or the rest of us through air quality problems and so on. So what can we do now to deal effectively with these wildfires in the northern part of the state? Let's just start with that.
Well, I would say that the concerns about climate change and things we might do to reduce climate change, I think, are all valid points and shouldn't be dismissed. Mm-hmm. However, when it comes to wildfires, that should not be our central focus. It's a distraction from our real problem. And Our real problem is the state of the forests. And right. This is due to fire suppression, which in forest has been highly successful to the point where it represents fire exclusion. We've simply eliminated a natural ecosystem process.
So people say better forest management. You hear that the whole time, that phrase. What does that look like? What have we been failing to? What's gone wrong with the policy there? Because this is now a question of governance and policy. Someone's in charge of this. People have made decisions. People in charge of the forest. What have they got wrong? What needs to change?
Well, I wouldn't describe it as bad forest management. I would describe it as fire management that has learned over time that the techniques of the past are probably not beneficial. They're probably destructive. It's what Eric Severide, this newscaster from the 1970s, used to refer to as most problems begin as solutions. And the solution was, let's put out the fires and we can keep fire out. That's created the problem. We have an anomalous level of fuels. And at the time, that was considered appropriate management practice. So what we're seeing today is the result of those management practices. At the time, they weren't considered wrong. Today, we know that they were wrong for these forest types. And so we need to change the management practice. Now, it is being changed, and it's been changed in some parts of the Sierra Nevada for a long time. For example, I'm stationed in Sequoia National Park. Sequoia National Park started prescription burning in the understory of the forest, particularly the giant sequoia forest, in 1968. And they have been doing burning every year since 1968. But realizing that they could really only treat a fraction of the landscape with prescribed burning for a lot of reasons. There's lots of constraints: money, firefighting resources to control the prescribed burns, air quality concerns, a lot of things limit it. So one of the additional programs they started in the late 1960s was what they called at the time the let burn policy. And that is, they pointed out that a lot of our wildfires are started by lightning in the backcountry of the park, and that they don't threaten any human resources. And as a result, they suggested we should not suppress those fires and we should just let them burn. And that let burn policy continues up till the present, although presently it is no longer called the let burn policy. There's probably a lot of socio-political reasons for not calling it that. The current terminology is wildfires for resource benefit. And so, in other words, when a fire occurs, the firefighters that are in charge of that landscape make a decision. Do we suppress it, or do we manage it for resource benefits by essentially allowing it to burn, watching it, and controlling it in areas where it may get out of control and cause damage to human resources? I just recently finished a research paper that looked at the history of prescribed fires as well as these wildland fires for resource benefit. And over the last 50 years, on average, every year, we've burned about the same amount of landscape with prescribed burns as with these wildfires that are managed for resource benefit. So we've essentially doubled the amount of landscape being prescribed burn. The problem is it's not nearly enough. And if you calculate what the fire return interval was prior to the Euro-American colonization of Western North America, we see that we're probably burning, less than 50% of the landscape we should be if we want to return to those conditions. And so we're not really getting close. We need to at least double the amount of that landscape being burned to approach that goal.
In a controlled way? Or in a way
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's the number one concern when fires occur is safety. So the number one issue is, well, is this fire a threat to humans and human resources like homes and cabins and that sort of thing? If the conclusion is it is not an immediate threat, then they are allowed to either do the prescription burn or allow the wildfire to burn and use it for resource benefit, namely reducing fuels. So,
but doesn't that process take years? I mean, something's going wrong. If we know prescribed burns work, you're very articulately explaining how it works, how it's been very effective, but our forest floors are still a complete mess. We're not doing as many prescribed burns as we need to. What's delaying it? What's the problem? Is it an administrative burden? It takes too long to get approval? Are people just not doing it? Like, why are we in the state we're in if we know this to be a good practice?
Well, I gave you the best case scenario, which is Sequoia National Park. The federal lands in the Sierra Nevada are managed by both the Park Service as well as the U.S. Forest Service. And they have different mandates and they have very different histories. For example, Sequoia and Yosemite started prescribed burning in the late 1960s. The forest did not begin until 2004. And so there is this long delay in using prescribed burns. Now, one of the primary reasons is national forests are managed for very different reasons. They're managed for what they call multiple use. In other words, you can use them for timber production, mining, recreation. Parks, on the other hand, are managed for retaining historical ecosystem processes. And so they have very different goals. And one of the things the forests have done for a long time is they have managed fuels by using mechanical means. And whereas the parks couldn't do that because you can't restore natural processes with mechanical treatments of fuels. But it was clear that mechanical treatments on the forest was never going to reach the goal of returning these systems to historical fuel levels. And so in 2004, they began an annual program of prescribed burns. The problem is they haven't really burned that much. That's one of the problems. And part of the reason is funding. Another part of the reason is increasing wildfires. If you have a wildfire burning on the landscape, all of your resources in that forest go to fighting the wildfire. And therefore, you can't do a prescribed burn simply because the resources are out there fighting wildfires. So increasing wildfires is one of the reasons we haven't been able to do as much prescribed burning as we might like to. Plus, the forests have fuels, which are these are lower elevation landscapes, and they're often much more flammable and produce higher intensity fires. And so the forests haven't been able to do nearly the level of prescription burning that would be necessary to return the systems to their historical condition. Let me just add one last point. The most important point is we didn't come to the realization that we needed to do this until the late 1900s. We had already had 100 years where we had perturbed the natural ecosystem and allowed fuels to accumulate. So we have a backlog of fuels to deal with. And so it's not a simple matter to take all of that into account, the amount of fuels that have accumulated and all of the constraints to get to where we should be. And the bottom line is, it doesn't look like at the present we're getting there. Now, this year, there's been a increase in funding availability to do more fuel treatments, and maybe that will change the outcome, but it remains to be seen.
But can I just don't get us started on funding?
I know, because but it's all a lie. Exactly. They say they make these announcements, whatever, Gavin Newsom, we're going to spend $1 billion, and then it turns out that it's a kind of fraction. The actual amount is a fraction of what's been announced. That's a I want to ask you to a little bit talk about the South, because it's a different problem there from what you were saying, John. But just before we leave the issue we've been talking about, I just want to understand: is there scope for much more? What I took from what you're saying is that there's a sort of limit to what you can do with the prescribed burns because of the various factors you listed, the safety and the air quality and so on. But could you do more with the right resources and funding through mechanical fuel reduction, mechanical means? Is there scope to do a lot more that way? I know it's hard, but could you do it?
Well, there's scope to do more. Whether it would be sufficient is a question I don't think we've answered. Part of the problem is the Sierra Nevada is a very rugged landscape. So there is a good portion of our landscape where you simply couldn't go in and do mechanical treatments. That prescribed burning is the only reasonable way to go about it. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert on this, so I wouldn't want to say definitively what the outcome is likely to be. But what I hear from colleagues who know more about these things than I do is we're a long way from ever getting to where we need to be in terms of reducing fuels to historical levels.
But this is the conversation we should be having, and they don't want to have it because it just shows up the mistakes. Quickly, let's go. We haven't got too much time, but I just want to quickly ask you to talk about the South, because you mentioned that it's a sort of different set of things there. Just outline for the southern part of the state, very different landscape and so on. What's the situation there with respect to wildfires? What are the problems? What are people not talking about or focusing on that they should be?
Well, the southern part of the state is very different in a lot of ways. It's different in types of fuels. It's different in the density of people. If you divide the state in half, there are about 10 times more people in the southern part of the state. Our worst fires in terms of human losses are generally those in the southern part of the state. And that's due to more people, more fire. And also we have these extreme wind events known as Santa Ana winds, and they make firefighting extremely difficult. In fact, during a Santa Ana wind-driven fire, the firefighters don't attempt to put out the fire. They try and control the edges, and they evacuate people. So fires are much, much worse. If you look at the history, past fire history of really big fires, like we had the Thomas Fire in 2017, at the time was one of the biggest fires in the state. Now it's been reduced to one of the less than big fires. The Woolsey Fire in a year after that. These big fires burned across landscapes that never escaped fire. They have burned repeatedly in the last 100 years. You'd be hard put to find any part of those landscapes that escaped a fire or multiple fires. And so as a result, those landscapes don't have an accumulation of fuels. And the solution for the forests in the past has been applied to Southern California, and that is we go in and treat fuels. Well, it turns out that's not the solution for Southern California. The problem there is not a fuel problem, it's a people problem. And in particular, our Santa Ana wind-driven fires, almost 100% are started by people. And since the year 2000, we've added 6 million more people to the state. Some counties, like Riverside in the southern part of the state, have increased by 35% in the last 20 years. This increases the number of opportunities for fire, both people starting fires as well as power line ignitions, which in the last 10 years have been the major source of fires in the southern part of the state as well as the northern part of the state. And more people means an increase in the electrical grid, more chances for distribution lines that may fail and start fires.
So that's fascinating. So you're saying, so if just again to summarize, the northern part of the state, the big problem is fuel, the accumulation of fuel. In the southern part of the state, the big problem is ignitions. And you said, it sounds to me like you were saying, this is like, we never talk about this. There's two types of ignition that we need to think about. One is the power lines, that's been part of the conversation. The second is like deliberately by people. Is that a real thing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Arson, which has always been a major source of fires, going back to the earliest records in the state. They didn't call them arson early on. They just called them incendiary fires. And incendiary fires meant fires that people started. Oftentimes, they didn't start them with the intention of doing damage. But by the late 1900s, it was pretty clear that people weren't starting fires on their own unless they had the intention of doing damage, and they were renamed arson fires. And for much of the last 50 years, it's been a major source of fires in the southern part of the state. But in the last 10 years, it's been superseded by power lines.
You never hear people talk about that.
Well, it's an interesting phenomenon, and there's actually a very good documentary on this that I just saw on TV not too long ago about a known arson in Southern California. Turned out it was a fire chief, and he was intentionally starting fires. And the reason appeared to be because he wanted to demonstrate his expertise at understanding the causes of fire.
Amazing.
So he would start fires, then he would go out and say, this is what caused those fires. In Southern California, it's a notorious case of major fires that resulted in loss of lives as well as property.
Okay. So look, we can talk about the arson. You say the power line thing is a bigger problem more recently. That sounds like a really, a problem we can fix.
Well, that's, I think, the most important point about recognizing that our big problem in Southern California is not the climate and as much as people and direct actions by people. It's a positive message. It says that we can do something about it. Do something about it, particularly when you look at our worst fires. They start during these extreme Santa Ana wind conditions. We get them every single year, but over the last 70 years, we've shown that 75% of our Santa Ana wind events don't have any fire at all, and that's because nobody started a fire or infrastructure didn't start a fire. So it says that we have the ability to control fires if we can control the power line ignitions. And there's a lot of emphasis on doing this right now. San Diego Gas and Electric in San Diego County has put in a program beginning about 2007 to increase maintenance. And it seems like it may actually be doing some good in that region. The county has not had a big power line ignited fire in a decade. So
that's a big deal.
Yeah, there is. Well, it could be serendipity. These things are controlled by a lot of events. But on the surface, it would appear that the San Diego Gas and Electric Company program is actually having a positive effect. And it's something that is being done now by PG&E in the northern part of the state, because they have suffered extreme lawsuits due to their power line failures, much of what was due to poor maintenance.
So last question then, Jon, last question on this. And then we have to leave it there. But I bet we'll be back talking to you about this, because this problem doesn't look like it's being solved anytime soon. On the power line thing, so what should they be doing because you hear talk about burying them? Is it actually as simple as just making sure the trees nearby are what does that mean to try and avoid these power line ignitions?
Well, it's being attacked on a number of fronts. In terms of maintenance, there are two things that need to be done, and that is the infrastructure of poles and lines needs to be better maintained. There are good examples of power line ignited fires due to utility poles that were out of date, like 25 years out of date. And so keeping up with maintenance is almost certainly one solution. Changing the types of equipment on power lines. There's been a lot of research coming out of the work in San Diego suggesting that there are improvements that we can make in power lines to reduce the possibility of sparks that would ignite fire. So changing those aspects of the infrastructure can have a big impact. In fact, likely will have a very big impact, but also maintaining the vegetation around power lines. Mm-hmm. And that's something that has not been done well in many regions. So increasing the maintenance. But in the meantime, the program that both San Diego and PG&E have focused on is what they call the Public Safety Power Shutdown program. And that is, until we get our maintenance problems solved, we need to shut off the power during high wind events. And that will reduce the probability of an ignition. Now, it may be the case. The problem is that it cuts off power for hundreds of thousands of people. Now, there's a positive side to that, though. Prior to the Public Safety Power Shutdown program, about the only people who worried about fire were those who lived right at the wildland interface. Today, we have the attention of hundreds of thousands of people because of this power shutdown program. So it's been a great advertising program for the importance of fire issues.
Well, listen, Jon, I think that great summary there, and I think we covered all the main points. You know what it leaves me thinking is weirdly optimistic. I mean, you've explained the challenges and the history of all this and the kind of real truth behind all this. But most of this is stuff that we can do. It's not just like throw your hands up in the air and say this is climate change. We can actually solve these problems with the right will and focus. So I'm left very optimistic, at least that it's possible to do something. And I really appreciate you coming in and sharing your expertise with us today. It was fantastic. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Steve and Kristen. It's been enjoyable. And I definitely agree that focusing on these immediate impacts of humans is a more optimistic message, because the individual citizen cannot necessarily do much about climate change, but they can do things that will impact reduction of human ignitions.
Exactly. Thank you, Jon.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Kristen, what do you make of that?
Well, I had a lot to say. Okay, I appreciated that he was pointing out when these energy companies are trying to do some good, but it's a little bit, give me a break. Because the only reason they're doing that is because, and I don't think people know this, that the legislature rushed through at Gavin Newsom's urging legislation that provided a fund, I think it's something like $12 billion for these energy companies to tap into so that they can go and fix their criminal negligence, go and fix their mistakes from the past. So this isn't like, the energy companies on their own are being so angelic and trying to prevent this. It's that we're paying for their problems.
Okay. And another point, I mean, I want to sort of, get this, but I touched on it there, but on the fuel reduction point, and the forest management. I mean, that's just been catastrophic under the Newsom regime, who've just completely, like at the beginning. Do you remember? I remember back a few years ago, President Trump made this point, and they just completely blew it off and said, no, it's climate change. And then even now he's finally come round to at least acknowledging that they need to do a better job. But then again, it's just complete spin and BS. So this is didn't he announce something like, what is it? With the budget, it was, I don't know, $1 billion announced for forest management. Then you had the extra money because the budget surplus was bigger than they expected, $2 billion. But when they actually published the actual amount of money for forest management was a fraction of that, something like 200 million. So they make these big announcements about what they're going to do, and it turns out they're not doing it, even in the face of these giant fires that they constantly use to make their political points.
That's exactly right. And even NPR called out Gavin Newsom saying...
Even NPR. How bad does it have to be? Yes, I think I spoke over you there. Just let's remind it. What did NPR say? Even NPR.
NPR said, wait a minute. He's running around saying that he's done all these fuel reduction projects and all these, prevention efforts. And he's full of it. He's actually slashed the budget by 40%. This is not the new budget. This is the old money that he said he was going to spend. He slashed that by 40%, and they'd only completed something like 10% of the projects when he was running around campaigning saying we did 100% of it. So NPR called him out as a liar. It just doesn't stop with that guy.
It's absolutely, it's unbelievable. How many times do we say it's unbelievable? It's so sadly believable. But at the same time, they're trying to exploit the fires for political purposes to make these arguments about climate change. They're actually not doing the things that could actually make a difference right here, right now. It is so infuriating, but so typical of the Democrat approach. It's all kind of virtue signaling and making political points instead of actually solving problems. That's why we need a change in this state. Well, that's going to wrap it up for us today at California Rebel Base. Make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review. We really appreciate all your feedback. We also appreciate those 5-star reviews. They really help us get the word out because we are the uncensored source for news about California. It's a big moment in this state. A lot of opportunity to bring some big changes, and we want your support doing it. And make sure you come back soon for the next California Rebel Base.